Thank you on behalf of the International Society for Quality of Life Studies for joining this webinar today. The webinar is titled Redefining Urban Inequalities in Relation with Quality of Life and Wellbeing, the Importance of Citizen Participation, presented by Graciela Tonon. I'll first introduce our moderators for this webinar, Anthony Lepentour and Parvas Dabir Alai. They're our ISQOLS VPs of online events. They will be facilitating the question and answer period and serving as discussants for the session today. And now to introduce our esteemed speaker. Graciela Tonon is a PhD in political sciences and a social worker. She has been dedicated to research on quality of life, well-being, and human development for 28 years. She is professor and researcher. Currently, she is the director of the Research Center in Social Sciences at Universidad del Plembro and the director of the Institute of Social Studies, UNICOM, at Universidad Nacional de Lomas de Zamora, Argentina. She joined ISQOLS 24 years ago, unbelievable. And she is currently the ISQOLS Vice President of Publications, the editor of the International Handbooks of Quality of Life series, and associated editor of Applied Research in Quality of Life. Graciela received the ISQOLS Distinguished Service Award for substantial contributing to a better understanding of quality of life studies in 2016. She is author of books, chapters, and scientific articles in English and Spanish language. She has also worked for 26 years as a social worker with children at risk in primary schools, hospitals, children's social services, and the Children's Court. Her topics of interest are quality of life, community, children and youth, inequalities, public policies, and qualitative research methods. She has also recently published a book, Urban Inequalities, a multi-dimensional and international perspective. Wow, what an impressive bio. And we are absolutely thrilled and honored to have Dr. Graciela Tonon as our speaker. Graciela, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jill, for the presentation. Well, at this moment of my life, I am part of the history, yes. Okay, well, we'll speak today about this topic, redefining urban inequalities in relation with quality of life and well-being, and the importance of citizens' participation. First of all, thank you very much for all the people that are here with us today, for my colleagues, Parvis and Anthony, obviously for Jill. Yes, let's start. Well, in this presentation, we will speak about these concepts, the concept of inequalities, of urban inequalities, quality of life, community well-being, public policies, and citizens' participation. We will start with the concept of inequality. Well, the study of inequalities acquired importance during the 19th and expanded during the 21st century, first developing in the field of economics. According to Ravi Kambur, the study of the economic dimension of inequality has a long history, and it is not only important per se, but also linked to many other topics in the social sciences. So we can identify different types of inequalities besides the income and the socioeconomic level, namely gender inequality, ethnic and racial inequalities, inequalities related to the life cycle, speaking about childhood, youth, and old age people, territorial inequalities between, for example, rural and urban zones, and between the different regions of each country, inequality of access to labor market, inequality of access to basic services, and those dimensions intersect and potentiate each other, particularly affecting certain population groups, such, for example, indigenous people and Afro-descendant women. In the 21st century, inequalities by age and by gender are considered among the determining axes of the distribution of well-being and power in society, because they are one of the bases of the social organization around which responsibilities and roles are assigned. Likewise, the convergence of multiple inequalities characterize the hard course of poverty, vulnerability, and social exclusion. and makes them persist and reproduce. So in this sense, inequalities matter to the well-being and the prosperity of a society. What are the different types of inequalities that the authors that studied these topics establish? Well, since the 19th and all over the 21st century, different authors have studied inequality. So we will first review the standing contributions. The first one, traditional and new inequalities. Then, inequalities in relation with capabilities, horizontal inequalities, categorical inequalities, intersecting inequalities, and relational inequalities. Let's start with the traditional and new inequalities. This is the work of Fitoussi and Rosanvallon since the last of the 19th. They identify new dimension of analysis of inequalities and propose the study of these two types of inequalities. The traditional inequalities, also called structural inequalities, have been studied and internalized by society, being fundamentally associated with the economic dimension. The new ones involve other dimensions of analysis, such as, for example, social inequalities, cultural inequalities, and religious dimensions. This author, Fitoussi and Rosanvallon, noticed that the new inequalities could disturb the representation that people can have of themselves and can therefore affect identity. And also pointed out that when inequalities increase, they affect the structure of a society, of the whole society. So the perception of the increase in inequalities in a society can be generating from a weakening of the principles of equality in this society, an increase in structural inequalities, and the emergence of new inequalities. So all this results in a process in which the three categories are dependent on each other. So they are combined. Another type of reflection of theorizing about inequalities are categorical inequalities. This was described and conceptualized by Tilly, who made reference to the categorical inequalities by expressing that inequality is a relation between persons or set of persons in which interaction generates greater advantage for one than for the other. The author argues that inequalities situate people on one side or the other of the categorical boundaries. And the categories are crucial because they shape both inequalities and identities. These classifications set categorical limits which people use to organize social lives and reproduce the inequality between members of different categories. Another possibility of explanation is the relation between inequalities and capabilities founded in the ideas of the Nobel Prize Amartya Sen, who explains that inequality has been traditionally assessed in terms of income, neglecting other types of inequalities. He stated that inequalities must be studied on the basis of choice of space, as well as other relevant variables such as well-being, freedom, and the different aspects of people's quality of life. The capability approach proposed by Sen identifies freedom as a major principle of development, and in this respect, it represents a theoretical proposition for the assessment of life satisfaction, perception of social institutions, design of public policies which affect economic development, social policies, and international development. So the capability approach provides an overarching structure for the understanding and measuring of equality, which focuses on what matters to people, recognizes diversity in needs, lays emphasis on barriers, constraints, structures, and processes, while recognizing diversity as regards goals. Another author concerned about this topic is Frances Stewart, who defines horizontal inequalities. No, this is the topic. She says that inequality is a major source of injustice and a cause of poverty, and sometimes of conflict. Thus, adopting a plural approach to inequality by encompassing several important dimensions. The vertical model of inequality, the traditional one, no, is based on ranking individual or households by their income, their assets, or human capabilities. But inequality in income distribution is a summary measure of the dimension of income and employment, which provides only a partial indicator of other dimensions. Besides being a vertical measure, since it considers the members of society from top to bottom, measuring their income and the consequent inequality. This author proposes a horizontal measurement of inequality, which would measure the inequality between groups, for example, defined by region, by ethnicity, by class, and or by religion, according to the most appropriate type of group identification in each particular society. These groups are socially defined by their members or by others, often based on common cultural characteristics and behavior, appearance, or place of birth. So horizontal inequalities greatly affects people's well-being directly, as well as other objectives. Some peoples are affected not only by their individual circumstances, but also by how well their group is doing, since being part of a group is often an important aspect of a person's identity. Cut across the economic categories and are related to social discrimination. Another type of theorization of inequalities is what we call the intersecting inequalities. The intersecting combine both horizontal and vertical characteristics, recognizing that the two approaches, vertical or horizontal, focus on distinct axes of disadvantage, resources, and identity. This is the work of Cavia. The vertical approach to inequalities is focused on income, as we previously said, and the horizontal approach to inequalities is based on social discrimination, which takes into consideration the social identity of different groups. So, give rise to social exclusion are deeply entrenched in the historical structures and everyday practices of societies, making them appear remarkably resistant to change. Group-based inequalities are the product of cultural norms and values and practices that enable the participation as equal citizens in the life of their community. Yet, people may suffer social discrimination without necessarily facing material deprivation, and it is in the intersection between these different forms of inequality that serves to define the most severe and often the most enduring form of social exclusion in societies. And then the final possibility of theorization are the relational inequalities. It's an original proposal in the study of inequality that focuses on relationships, which has led us to review the research work developed by the Indian economist Ghosh. She believes that human beings are inherently social and that their individual capacities are socially regulated, and in turn, regulate their own social relationships. These interactions, likewise, undergo changes in time and are affected by the dynamics of broader economic and social processes. Though traditionally, most debates on distributive inequality have generally been focused on material goods or services. Today, there is a recognition of what is known as relational equality, which involves egalitarianism, as well as the demands of contemporary social movements. The aforementioned goes beyond distributive inequality, for it acknowledges different kinds of social and hierarchical inequality, particularly in the form of persistent group inequalities, which are sustained by laws, norms, or habits that generate higher or lower levels of social interaction. So let's speak about inequalities, particularly in the urban space. During the last decades, urban expansion and the decentralization of employment policies have become the processes with the highest incidence on spatial mismatch, since these processes have changed people's homes, location options, as well as their job opportunities. The new economy has boosted urban inequality in three different ways, namely a greater labor market bifurcation resulting in a deepening income inequality, an increase in interurban inequality, and the resurgence of central cities, which have gradually become more unequal. For example, greater classification and inequality between the different suburban areas. So this is the concept of spatial inequalities, that differences in development associated with place-based characteristics such as remoteness, high density, poor municipal infrastructure provision, and often coincide with intersecting inequalities. So spatial inequalities often overlap with intersecting inequality, for example, in the case of socially excluded groups concentrated in the most disadvantaged location or neighborhoods. These social, economic, and spatial inequalities in turn contributed to political disenfranchisement. Such groups were generally denied voice and influencing collective decisions that affected their lives. Although the debates on urban inequality have given greater relevance to the study of residential segregation patterns, the different dimensions of urban inequality are interactively intertwined and interrelated. The existence of the interrelations between different dimensions or forms of urban inequality reinforces the need to expand studies in that field. And if we speak about urban inequality, we need to reflect to quality of life and well-being. Only summary this kind of concept when analyzing urban inequality in the 21st century. Quality of life and well-being should also be taken into account, a focus which several authors have begun to adopt. For example, the case of Barton Meeting and Satterthwaite, who refer to urban housing by pointing out that urban inequalities are expressed through highly stratified spatial realities structured both by the market and by the government. Contrasts can be identified in urban housing's quality, density, and levels of provision with significant implication for health and quality of life. In my case, I developed a study with one of colleagues, Javier Martinez and Claudia Michels, and Javier Martinez is also a member of ISQOLS, which expresses that the geography of social justice and the concept of the just city must necessarily be considered when studying the quality of community life. For this purpose, we propose a socio-spatial theoretical lens that illuminates the unjust quality of life conditions within and between communities and make it possible to trigger policy responses to more equitable outcomes, processes, and social inclusion. It is likewise possible to observe that database economy is definitely concentrating urban areas, thus generating new forms of spatial inequality, both within and between cities and urban populations. There has been a widening of the income gap. Disparity in cities has increased. The suburbs have been broadly reclassified according to social groups, ethnic, and cultural origins. It is, on the other hand, we analyze the relationship between quality of life and urban mobility. With that, we should consider the research work carried out by Giampaolo Nuvolati, who regards the concept of accessibility of services and public transport as crucial in the assessment of quality of life in the city. Accessibility of services may be assessed on the basis of educational, cultural, and economic disparity. It may also be approached in terms of traffic, public transportation system, and other issues related to urban mobility. So let's speak about community well-being. In the case of daily in urban communities, community well-being is worth taking into account. Community well-being is a combination of social, economic, environmental, cultural, and political conditions properly identified to flourish and reach their full potential. Community well-being has generally referred to the social, cultural, and psychological needs of the subject, their families, and their communities. The definition of community well-being was influenced by health, poverty, public transportation, economic activity, as well as by environmental and ecological considerations. So let's speak about well-being. In this regard, the notion of well-being ought to be considered not only from a personal perspective, but also in social terms, since the opportunities are of equal importance, whether they are offered to a group or to an individual, which means that all definitions of well-being should be contextualized, taking into account both the population and the place in which its members develop their daily life. Let's speak a little about life satisfaction. At this point, the concept of life satisfaction ought to be clarified, for it represents a report of the way in which individuals assess their life as a whole, whether at a certain point in time or the evaluation of their life development since they were born. And since the question about their general life satisfactions allow people to make a fundamental connection with the feelings they are experiencing at that moment, the questions that should be asked must be related to the specific dimension of these persons' lives to obtain a more concrete assessment of the situation they are going through. For example, in the concrete case of community satisfaction, the latter implies satisfaction with several situations. For example, I consider some indicators about perception of safety on the streets and in public places, social services, interaction with neighbors, equipment and infrastructure, public transportation, the possibility of working in the community, and enjoyment of leisure time with other members of the community as well. The possibility of exchanging points of view and discussing worries and problems of mutual concern. So, considering of these present topics, we will go to the last part of the presentation and we will speak about public policies to overcome inequalities. So the analysis of the public policies to overcome inequalities lead us to the notion that though social inequalities measured culturally and historically and varies from one moment or place to another, it can still be argued that contemporary inequalities are mostly determined by the prevailing forms of production and associated to labor relations which tend to operate at larger, even global scales. The previous characteristics are vital to the analysis and design of public policies. which have to lead us to study of inequalities in relation to democracy. The national government plays a fundamental role in the elimination of the inequalities of a country. And in this regard, local government is most often the official level through which inequalities in services and provision are addressed. In his paper on lateral thinking, for example, in Atkinson, tackled these conceptual issues by pointing out that inequality excels the income and reveals the question of inequality in other dimensions, such as health and education. In this regard, also Cambur states that the main conceptual point lies in the fact that the correlation between income and health is a natural source of inequality, detached from income inequality and health inequality per se. This ought to be considered when it comes to deciding on public policies on the matter. Atkinson identified 5 ideas in the distribution of income to mitigate inequality: technology, employment, social security, the sharing of capital, and taxation. So according to Cambur, what Atkinson proposes aims at the general improvement regarding social protection and security, achieved through the universal right to a basic income in a new system of social security. So another thing to consider is the social protection system. At this point, we must consider this concept, which Sen defines as a stable social protection framework. For example, the state's fundamental institutional mechanisms, as well as the citizens' extraordinary support in emergency situations. In this respect, Fitoussi and Rosa Albajon also propose a social protection system that contemplates the subject biographical trajectories to prevent the incidents that may occur in their daily lives deriving in social determinants. So we have further considered the research work on inequality of another Nobel Prize Stiglitz, which proposes an extension of individual rights, for example, public policies to mitigate inequality. Stiglitz proposed an active participation of civil society as public assets that may function to control abuse of power or influence. So finally, we must take care of this important topic, the citizens' participation. Well, only to make a little remembering, actually it is possible to recognize 2 visions of citizenship. One that is considered the traditional one, referring to the relation of the citizens with the state, the society, and the rules of participation in public life. But now, in this century, we have another one, defined as new citizenships, that emerge in relations to the process of globalization, the advance of technology, the migration movement, the intercultural processes, and the social recoveries. The process of configuration of citizenships derives from the different ways in which people relate to each other and from the ways they construct their community life. Well, participation implies considering subjects as the protagonists of the decisions. So if we only speak about acting conjointly, we are not really speaking about participation, as it is more than acting together. Yes, participation, it is about making decisions together. In this way, we can recognize 2 types of participation, the real participation and the symbolic participation. The real participation occurs when the members of a group or of an organization take part effectively in all institutional processes and in the nature of decisions. This implies the democratization of knowledge and the redistribution of power to make the necessary changes in response to social needs. But the other type of participation, called symbolic participation, for a Latin American author called Sivent, she said that this kind of participation is one that makes people have the illusion of participate, but really people do not influence in the decisions. So when we speak about citizens' participation, it is vital to consider that the process of policy decision to reduce inequality for citizenship cannot only be considered as a natural category, since it depends on public and intersubjective relationships. In the last decades of the 20th century, the notion of citizenships has undergone a process of redefinition that made recognition and diversity visible, giving rise to the issue of ethnic and gender identities, thus expanding the debate on the classic notion of citizenship from the discourse that promotes integration to one of recognition of diversity. The different processes for acquisition and transformation of citizenships take place around the processes that shape social life and the individual's life trajectories. This is based on a dynamic and relational conception of citizenship in which social practices are the center of the argument and in which citizenship is a multidimensional character, is conceived as being composed by a few elements whose specific interrelations defines its social dynamics in each group or social context. Citizens' participation is a set of actions, though, which citizens become involved in the design, decision, and implementation of public affairs affecting or concerning them. I propose the use of quality of life and well-being research results for the decision of public policies, which may enable governments to identify the needs of society and design public policies that may generate programs to boost people's quality of lives and reduce inequalities. So, and finally, seeking to overcome inequalities. In other words, the inequality studies research field has made contributions in conceptual and theoretical issues on the one hand, and far-reaching research of empirical problems on the other hand. Having completed this tour, we can conclude in accordance with Cambur that inequalities are multidimensional in theory, outcomes, and causes, encompassing the economic, the social, and the political. Economic forces are not the only one place on inequality, but they are important by themselves and in conjunction with others. A society with fewer inequalities requires a government that considers the current environmental challenge, migration, and the increasing healthcare costs. Moreover, an equal society recognizes the individual's diverse needs, situations, and goals, and seeks to expand their capabilities by doing away with discrimination and prejudice, while tackling the economic, political, legal, social, and physical conditions that constrains people's achievements and limit their substantial freedom. Quality of life, for me, is an interdisciplinary concept that offers the possibility of a new theoretical outlook for working on people's potentialities with a community anchorage that includes the analysis of the social political context and where each person is considered a protagonist. Thus, we can state that quality of life presents a social and political reality that must be necessarily based on an integrating respect for human rights. To overcome inequalities, a society first needs to identify existing inequalities and make decisions to resolve them. To do this, it is necessary to generate public policies in response to the social problems of the population, as well as counting on citizens' participation to achieve this. While I present my recent book, Urban Inequalities, a Multidimensional and International Perspective, the general objectives of the books are propose an interdisciplinary and multidimensional perspective of urban inequalities, analyzes the situation of children, youth, and indigenous people, highlights the importance of policymaking and citizens' participation in overcoming inequalities. In this book, there are 17 chapters. Some of them written by another extraordinary authors. Yes, so I invite to read it. And well, this is the two places where I work actually, and this is my mail in case you want to ask me some other question after this webinar. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for to listen to me. So this is the moment to open to questions.
Thank you very much, Graciela. What a fantastic coverage of so much detail and so much literature. Thank you. Sorry, I can't get my camera to work at the moment. I can't see any questions in the chat, but I'm sure people will want to put their points to you in a second. But if I may just myself kick off with a couple of quick points. As I was listening to your presentation, 2 points came to me. One, I think, very important point is to remember the concepts of inequality in the context of peer-to-peer measures. I can't help but think of a quotation from the famous British philosopher of the early part of the 20th century, gentleman by the name of Bertrand Russell. He once said something along the following lines: beggars do not envy millionaires, though of course they will envy other beggars who are more successful. I thought that's really quite telling. So here, okay, you can see me now. So it's interesting. The common approach to thinking on these issues might be to say someone who's very poor, maybe on the breadline, at the level of a beggar, might be envious of very wealthy individuals within society. But according to Russell, at least, it seems that their rivalry, in a sense, is with other beggars. So they get upset. So anyway, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but the concept of perceptions of inequality at the level of peers within society, I think is very important. The other quick point, which you alluded to, and it's very clearly displayed in the on the cover of your book, and that is that that the whole issue of inequality, well-being, poverty, however way we choose to phrase it, is always multidimensional. And of course, in the writings of Amartya Sen, that was very, very important. It's Sen's writing that gave birth to the whole notion of multidimensionality through his capability approach and other ideas that he's come up with. So I want to leave my comments at that point, really, for reflection, really. And but I'd be interested to see what you think about this issue of peer pressure, peer context. What do you think about that? And hopefully there will be other questions from your audience.
Okay, Parviz, I want to say thank you very much to two persons that are with us today that are the authors of one of the chapters, and this is a special chapter. I am the person that Julie Ruska and Catalina Langen. They wrote the chapter related to hello Julie, hello Catalina, particularly to citizens' participation in they work in civil well-being partners. And the important thing of this chapter for me is that most of the chapters of the book have chapters of different places of the world. They're representing all the continents. But the chapter from Julie and from Catalina is a real program of working with the people, yes, in Santa Monica. So I don't know if Julie and Catalina, please tell all the audience something about it, about your work. And thank you to be there with us today.
Yes, I'm here. It's Catalina here. I'm so sorry I'm not able to be on camera right now. But yeah, this is just, if I can just have a minute to share some of my thoughts. My brain is kind of really going now because it is helpful to have our work sort of situated within the context of the research and sort of what is the, I guess, research narrative being shared at the highest levels, because we really are embedded in community and really on the ground, working with people. I do think that coming up with creative and artistic ways for people to engage is an important dimension of helping people break through apathy and issues around citizen participation, which we know are, as Dr. Tonon shared in the research, really preventing greater equality from coming to light, because we just do have such low levels of participation, at least in the US, beyond voting every 4 years. I also wanted to ask about, like, where in the research, in my experience, I find that leadership within institutions is super critical, in order for it, like, it has to be a two-way street between citizens and leadership. Like, I don't think it can just come from citizens deciding to participate more. So I wonder what in the literature, I know you mentioned the role of the federal government, but even sort of at the local and regional levels, like, how can we, what does the research say about, I guess, institutional leadership in improving issues of inequality and quality of life? And I would be also happy to talk more about the interventions that we have taken around well-being programming in community as well. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Catalina. Julie?
The only thing that I want to add to what Catalina said, first of all, thank you so much for doing this. It's really early in the morning here on the West Coast, so voices are just coming and just waking up. So I just want to say that, but it's really nice to be with you all. And I do want to say that I think there may be something to the points that Catalina was making about, as we try to sort of close these gaps of inequality, things may in many ways get worse before they get better, or there's different dynamics that come about in the closing of the gap. So I think this issue of on the ground community and what's happening in community, as well as leadership and pipelines of leadership, are extremely important as we work to create change. And that's very present here for us in the US and Santa Monica as well, and all across the world. So I'm thinking about those topics as well. Thank you all.
No, thank you. And another thing I want to tell you is that with us, there are two, Joe Sirgi, that is one of the creators of all the books and all the researchers about community well-being. I study all the books of Joe to say the little things about because well, thank you very much. So he's always with us in the webinar. Thank you for all the things we can learn from your work. Yes.
I'm
Okay.
just wondering, Graciela, if there are any other questions that anyone wishes to raise for you. Anthony, please. I see your hand is up.
Yes, sure. Well, thank you very much, Graciela, for this super interesting talk. I mean, I loved it, and I think everybody did. So thank you very much. Yeah, no, I was actually thinking more or less something along the line of Parviz, I think, because there are many papers, for instance, not taking into account the multidimensionality, of inequality, and looking at basically the impact of the Gini, which is basically it's income, basically.
Yes, it's income.
On well-being, and the papers find positive, negative, no effect. Like, it's very, very, very messy. But what we know for sure is that people compare, people look at others, and maybe, at some point you said, like, we need to identify inequality before acting upon inequalities. So I'm wondering which kind of inequality shall we really identify? Is it like objective inequality revealed by survey, or is it more like what people think about inequalities?
Well, this is a situation. Okay, wonderful, extraordinary, and thank you for this question. Well, first of all, you need to remember that I live in the place more unequal of the world. Yes, that is South America. Yes, because there are another places more poor, but not more unequal. Yes. People in migration, since we were born, are accustomed to live in situation of inequalities. And I think something like a decade ago, after I retire as a social worker in daily life, because as social worker I work at the streets with the people, I begin to think about the possibility of what people define as inequality. Not me, common people. And it was surprisingly, Anthony, because people sometimes have no money, but the problem with inequality is not the money.
Mhm.
It's the relations, it's a discrimination because of the age or because of the gender or because of the religion or something like this, for them are more important than the money. Yes?
That's exactly what I was thinking about.
Well, I begin to study the situation of what is inequality for the people. And at the moment, I am preparing a book about inequality in higher educations by center in what the student define inequality. When I ask them about inequality, and incredible, most of them don't put in the first place the money. Yes, so I think that we need to begin to understand, considering what the famous pedagogist of Latin America, Paulo Freire, said, the symbolic universe of the people. What we have in our mind and in our head, what is a representation of the concept for each of us and for the different region of the world and the different culture.
No, I
Include,
agree.
if we consider Occident, no, the West, if we consider the West, not all the people that are living in the West, from the north to the south, are thinking in the same way. Very important differences. So when the government take a decision about a public policy, really, they need to know what the people are defining and saying about this. I know it's very difficult what I am proposing, but these kind of things make me the possibility to relate it, the inequalities with well-being and quality of life, not only considering the economic dimensions.
No, I agree. I agree with you. It looks scary. It looks scary
Wonderful.
because we need to understand what inequality means for people. So it might be a bit scary, but I agree with you. That's the way to go. So we should not be
Yes.
afraid of this.
Yeah, well, for me too. For me
Mhm.
too. But I need to recognize that this is what is happening now, because perhaps I grew up in another different world in the last century, but the things changes, and we need to know about these changes.
And I think if I might just add to the
Yes.
point that you're making now to tie back into what Catalina said, again, this is Julie speaking. I think that there are really interesting creative ways to get to understanding about that aren't just the ways that we in institutions tend to work. And really using the creative practices, indigenous practices, culturally defined and created practices really help people. And we've really had that experience when we tried to take something that, this idea of well-being and community well-being as a framework for government, which is what where we started in Santa Monica when just over 10 years ago. One of the things we found was that in order for it to really have utility, both in the government and in the community and in our, we had to build some shared understanding. It's like creating a new language almost, or creating new understandings. And I do think the point of how you go about doing that and having that go beyond, like taking the research, the science, the things that have been studied, but really building bottom up, top down, horizontally across systems. What people in education are thinking about is different from public health, the economy. So it really is very multifaceted, and there's many approaches. And I think that's the point that I would like to sort of highlight to the conversation you were just having. So thank you.
No, thank you, Julie. Thank you very much. Okay, Joe.
Right.
Hi, Joe. Thank you.
Yeah,
Question, Joe?
allow me to say something. I just attended the World Urban Forum in Cairo, Egypt, just a couple of weeks ago. And one of the things that it struck me is that there was quite a bit of conversation and discussion about social cohesion. And this is something that we haven't seen in the past. So social cohesion was almost like um, a central, a key issue in many of the discussions. And there's no way that you can achieve social cohesion without dealing with inequalities. So all the stuff that you're talking about seems to
Oh,
resonate
wonderful.
at the global level. So
Yes, thank you. I don't have a chapter about Egypt, but I love it. I love to have it. Yes, because when the person go in relation with another places and culture, discover things incredible, no, that perhaps we are not thinking previously. But then we begin to speak with people from other parts of the world, and perhaps we say near the same thing, but with different words in some cases too, no? But we are really thinking in the same things. So extraordinary. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Always thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank
There's a
you.
question, Graciela, for you in the chat. I don't know if
Mhm.
you can see it. It says, following Anthony's
Following
question.
Anthony's.
Oh, you can read it. Are you
Yes.
able to address that?
Yes. Well-being is often measured with subjective means, and while quality of life has objective, useful for policy, structural system, but for people, it is in their everyday life where subjective life is more important. At least I imagine. I don't know. And continue. How do researchers balance this? Do you have advice? I am not sure if I understand totally, but well, first of all, quality of life consider the objective and the subjective too, not only the objective. Yes, first of all. And then when we are doing this kind of research, we first obviously begin with a methodological approach that is qualitative, trying to uh, understand what people are considering, what are the people opinion. So first to measure, we need to are really to have really clear what are we measuring. Yes, because if not, if I only like, for example, an index and try to do again and again the index, but I have no time previously to reflect what is the theoretical background of this index, because the people that think about it think this from a theoretical view. So perhaps this theoretical view is not in line with the group or the social group we are trying to use the index, for example. Yes, this kind of question, I think that we need particularly to work with the young researchers about this kind of theoretical epistemological reflection, not only to reproduce the instruments.
Can I just fit in one final question, Graciela, to you,
Yes.
if I may? I find the discussion of inequality always fascinating, really interesting. But many years ago, thinking about this, I decided to write a paper in which I argued that maybe even a more important uh, area to look at if one's interested in issues to do with inequality, well-being, etc., is to focus on vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the question of what makes an individual or individuals within a society vulnerable is equally exciting and equally challenging as compared to looking at questions of inequality and well-being, because vulnerability, similar to inequality, is multifaceted and multidimensional. But it kind of, I think, in my mind anyway, it focuses our attention really a lot more on where the kind of thresholds of life and lack of life really is when you start thinking about issues specifically in relation to vulnerability, because that then allows you to define the dimensions quite clearly. And I think it was in 2006 when James Foster and one of his students, I forget the name, created a multidimensional poverty index in 2006, and that had 18 dimensions, 3 groups, but 18 dimensions. And that was also based on this notion of vulnerability, which I found really exciting to think about. Anyway, I think we're out of time, but
we are on time. Yes, Jill is there looking for us.
Yes, so I just want to put that in, but thank you again for a fascinating paper, and you generated a lot of really good comments from Anthony, from Joe, from other colleagues. So well done,
No,
very
thank
good.
you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all the colleagues. And in case you have more questions, please write to me. No, no problem. I will always answer. Yes, please, Anthony. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank
Jill,
you. And
thank you very much.
yeah, and on that note, we will end the webinar, but I just wanted to say thank you so much to Graciela Tonon for your excellent presentation. Thank you to Anthony and Parvis for moderating the question and answer period. And thank you to all of our participants tuning in from all over the world. A reminder that we will be uploading this webinar on our YouTube page, and I'll send that out to everyone along with an invitation to consider, please, attending any of our upcoming conferences and future webinars, as well as becoming an ISQOLS member. If you are not already a member, we'd love to have you join our community. Graciela, muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias a ti.
Thank you to everyone. Good to see you all.
Bye.
And
Thank you.
See you soon.
Julie, Catalina, Joe, all the colleagues. Thank you very much. Bye. Thank you, Jill.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.